seizure, and I didn't know what to do, so I put my hand inside his mouth. So before I start, I have one of the slides that says share knowledge. I'm going to share knowledge right now. Never, ever, ever put your mouth inside a person that's having a seizure. Just roll him and call 911 or 112. That's it. Cool, so let's start. And by start, I'm going to roll to the first slide. Here we go. So before we start, everybody in the room knows what A11Y means. Show of hands. Cool. Just a quick introduction. I'm Cristiano Correia. I have a weird profile because I'm one of those that codes and draw. So I have a background in engineering and in design. And this weird profile allowed me to actually travel quite a lot. I work for some major companies in Europe. I've lived in Belgium and in the Netherlands. And that's why I came across accessibility. This profile allow me to arrive where I'm now. I work at Zalando, and the easiest way to show what Zalando is showing a 1-minute video. So I'm going to get rid of that very quickly. So Zalando, it's this company, if the internet works. So very quickly, Zalando is the leading e-commerce platform for fashion in Europe. We have around 15,000 employees, just engineers alone. We are 2,500, something like that. And we have a booth right here, so if you want to know more, we're always interested in knowing very interesting people. So just pass by. So there we go. So how did I discover A11Y? When I was a very young designer and engineer, I had a cool project. It was for a company that owns a dam. And they had a very intriguing irrigation system. And they asked the company I worked at the time to design the interface for the farmers that used the dam water. So I wanted to show up, like, how cool am I? I did a very complicated, not this is cool, I don't design cool things, but I did a very complicated interface with all the graphics, with all the water, with all the cubic meters. What's the problem there? Again, they're farmers. They don't really care that much about those numbers. They walked with the tablets on their farms, and they wanted to do quick actions. They wanted quick buttons and really quick actions. So I kind of Googled big text or big buttons, I don't remember, and I came up with 4 letters. A11Y, which means accessibility. The 11, it's the 11 letters between the A and the Y, which is not a very accessible name for A11Y, for accessibility, but there you go. A11Y means accessibility. Just destroying a myth right now. This is from the A11Y project. It quickly explains the biggest problem in interpreting A11Y is it's not for blind people. Yes, it's for blind people, but it's way more than that. There are actually 4 categories for accessibility, and 1 extra that I'll explain in a second. So the obvious one, it's visual, but it's for blind people, of course, but there's way more than that. Can be myope like me or the people in the back with small screens. That's a visual impairment. Can be more specific. Colorblind people actually don't interpret colors like the rest of us. And even more than that, you don't know how are they consuming your product. So a very bad screen cannot, or maybe it's not going to display your product as you design it. So the second category for accessibility is auditory. It's kind of self-explaining. Videos and audio sounds, it's very complicated for this type of users. Then we have motor. We kind of assume for granted that if it's on a phone, it's touching, or if it's a desktop, you interact with mouse, but not all of us can do it. We also have the last category, it's cognitive. We don't interpret things the same way. We're all different, and some of us have more difficulty in understanding some subject than others. The extra one is a temporary disabled one, and ta-da, this was not planned, but it's the easiest way of showing this. I actually had a different explanation for this, but this one works. So this is a Windows phone. It's dead, but it was not the greatest operating system of all time, but it was excellent in one thing, user interface. They had the concept that if you have large screens, all the actions are at the bottom. So this was the calendar of Windows Phone, and you basically could do everything around the bottom of the page. This was like 4, 5 years ago, maybe, and now the other ones are catching up. This is Samsung's new UI. It's called One UI, I believe. And since the screens are so tall, they put everything at the bottom and just put some type at like hours or the subject of the screen. So you are always temporarily disabled when using your phone with one hand. You're usually using your thumb. That's the fifth, not fifth, category of accessibility. So what can we do? I want you to remember 4 things that by the end of this talk, 4 things that you have to worry. One is your product needs to make sense. It needs to be understandable. Please worry about keyboard inputs, where you thought about mouse inputs or touch inputs. I'll explain why with an example from Microsoft. This is Xbox Adaptive Controller. It's very recent. The way this is such a game changer, it's because of the back. If you see those icons here, they're actually remappable. It's actually the entire controller that you can remap to different inputs. And when you do your product, your web product, if you map keyboard inputs, on the other way, it's maybe an E or an M or a space bar or an enter, it's mapped to something else. So that's why keyboard inputs are so important. And it's spreading to more than keyboard, like Microsoft is showing the way on gaming. This is a good example. It's very expensive. I think it's $100, something like that. But it shows the way of how to make your product more accessible to others. Third thing that I want you to remember, please think about content alternatives. I know this is very hard, especially for designers. When you design your product, you want it to transmit it in one way, but maybe that's not the right way, or not the only way that people understand stuff. The last one, please care about contrasts. That screen is a bit dark. The NES should not be as clear there, so it was a quick example of contrast. But imagine that the S is not that readable. So I'll speak about contrast a bit later. And then I came up with the 5-step process for this talk. One of them, you know, it's the last one, is share knowledge, yay. But let's start at the start. How do we know this? Does anyone have any idea on how do we know our audience? Don't all speak at the same time. Okay, spoiler alert, it's all of us. Accessibility, it's not for a specific group, it's for all of us. Why? By the official numbers of ONU, it's 15% of the entire population is disabled, which is incorrect, because it doesn't count for all the disabled. I'm disabled, I'm myope, but I don't count as a disabled person because I can wear glasses or contact lenses or so on. So this number is very misleading. Be careful of assumptions. Me and farmers, yeah, you never assume your user can understand what you design just because you understand what's there. be inclusive because you never know who's on the other side. You might think you're developing something for a specific type of groups, and maybe gamers know that they actually can hold a controller and control your game, but then Microsoft think maybe we could spread. Empathize. For a simple reason, you might be on the other side sooner than later. Like, I'm a temporary disabled user now. Also, if more people get to your product, cool. More user base, more money, more revenue. It's just common sense. Lastly, don't get fined. So the European Accessibility Act, I think it's going to be voted next month. But that doesn't mean that you cannot get fined before. I've worked for some companies that I'm not going to disclose that got fines because of accessibility issues. It's mainly because of financial data or personal data that get fined. But this is a problem. So, and if the European Accessibility Act is voted as a yes, this will be on your hands from April, I think. Just Google it. I think the voting is in April. So, this chapter, it's that accessibility is for all of us and not for a specific group of people. Second step is how do you test it? There's a bunch of guidelines. It's huge documentation. The first one is for tools that, this is all, by the way, published and managed by W3C. The first one is for tools that allow to create content. Some examples are CMSs or EasyWigs, maybe some editors. So if you work on that field, those are the guidelines for you. The user agents is more for browsers and for user agents that allow people to get in contact with different content. So that's a different set of guidelines. Those are extremely specific, so I'm just going to mention them. If you work on those fields, these are the guidelines for you. A more quick check is A11Y. A11Y can check your code very quickly. It's a node dependency. You just install it globally on our machine. You have to have Node installed. You just run it against a website. This is actually Google, and you found 3 mistakes on the HTML. Yes, Google makes mistakes. It's mainly about some obsolete HTML. It's quite irrelevant. Actually, the score about accessibility of the website of Google, if I'm not mistaken, it's 91. It's one of the slides, but they're pretty good at accessibility. They're one of the biggest, if not the biggest contributor to A11Y. The second one is .A11Y. This is actually published by Khan Academy. It's a platform with the learning stuff. So what it does, it's a small library that you add to your projects, and it pops up this, I have a pointer, doesn't work, this lovely thingy. And you can check on the fly stuff like contrast, if you have the right headers, if they're the right order, stuff like that. It's very useful if this is your first contact in checking your projects with accessibility. Chrome extensions all the way. There are Chrome extensions for every single thing, from contrast to colorblind to screen readers. Whatever you need to check, probably someone else already developed the extension for it. So just Google Chrome extension and then what you need to check. This is from the A11Y project also. There's a checklist, a quick checklist. If you never thought about accessibility on a project, it's going to have a few checks, like if you have a roll on your body, stuff like that. If you go through that check and if you don't have the vast majority of them, your product is really not accessible. But nothing beats the audit from what I've encountered from the Chrome DevTools. So Chrome DevTools, it's this lovely thing. At the top, there's a bunch of things. If you're a developer, you're probably pretty aware of console and network and stuff like that. There's one called audit. It audits a bunch of things, including performance. There's one of them, which is accessibility. And accessibility goes through the guidelines that I'm going to mention right after and tell you, hey, this maybe should be changed, or there's this problem, and so on. Again, 91%. This is Google's website, so even the big ones make mistakes. Third step. So I already know the state of my product. How do I change it? This is the guidelines that are most important for you, I assume. Bad assumption, I don't know. And it's the ones from the audit. It's called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG2, which is on version 2.1. And it has 3 levels of compliance, A, AA, and AAA. These 3 things, these 3 grades, are measured through 4 principles. Each principle has subjects that's going to evaluate your product. And each subject has some checks that needs to be checked. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot, but I'm going to speak about the principles, what each principle measures, and then an example of compliance. So the first one is perceivable. Your project needs to be understandable and perceivable by the user. What this means is these are the areas where this is evaluated. Text alternatives mean that whatever you have that is not text offers a text alternative. Very quick example, if you ever put an image on your project, there's the alt attribute, please use it. It's mandatory, it's actually HTML invalid. The HTML is invalid if you use image without the alt attribute, and it tells a screen reader, for example, what the image is. Second one is time-based media. Time-based media means media that are not static. Obvious examples are video and audio, and it evaluates if those type of media are accessible to your user. Third one is adaptable, means that your project can adapt to your user. I have one example when I'll speak about CSS, but think about responsive. That goes towards the temporary disabled user, for example. I'm not going to spoil the example I have, so just a second. And distinguishable, the contrast enters here. Imagine that you have two content that are very similar. The user needs to perceive it as different. So one of the things that's evaluated under time-based media is captions. And if you have pre-recorded captions for your media, it's A-compliant. If you have captions that appear to your user live, it's AA compliant. And if you have sign language for your media, it's AAA compliant. Second principle is operable. Your user must have a way to interact with your product. Again, these are the areas where it's evaluated. I already spoke about how keyboard accessible is so essential. Enough time. Have you ever asked those menus that you hover, opens the menu, and when you go over, if you hover outside, it goes away? You didn't give enough time for a user to make mistakes. This is evaluated. Seizure and physical reactions. So if you have, YouTube is a great example about this. YouTube fails this one because it doesn't control the content of its users. And there are content in YouTube that can cause seizures and physical reactions. So like flashy stuff. If you have a way to control this, you'll be compliant. If you don't have a way to control this, you won't be compliant, and YouTube fails here for obvious reasons. Navigable, that might be a mistake. Navigatable, you need a way to navigate your project, basically. So menus, quick links, go to the top, go to the bottom, stuff like that. It's what this measures. Input modalities, it's one of the least obvious. This means that the way you designed the inputs might not be obvious to your users. Are any devs in the room? Show of hands. Cool. Have you ever programmed a mouse down or a mouse up? No? Both? Yeah. Are you sure a user can do a mouse up and a mouse down? Imagine a disabled person that doesn't have, let's say, full control of his arm, and it puts a mouse down, and your event is on mouse up. This is what input modality evaluates. You need to make sure the way you designed the interaction with your product, it's possible by the user. Quick example, the link purpose. If a link is understandable what it does in the context, it's A-compliant. And if the link is understandable by its own, it's AAA compliant. The AA compliant has no measure in this category. Third one is understandable. The user needs to understand your product. There's three things here. Readable means that obviously the user can ask to know how to read your product or be able to read your product. This might be as simple as language. If you sell a product to multiple countries, but you only have your own language, that fails here. Predictable, we are, as a group of people, or people in general, we get used to stuff. And if you change paradigms, and I'm going to speak about that when I speak about CSS, if you change paradigms that are standards, users are not going to understand it as fast. And the third one is the most obvious of these three. It's input assistance. If you help your users get through your products, it's one of the things that is measured here. That's one of the examples I have. So error prevention, if you tell users, like choosing password, if you tell at front the criteria to prevent the error, there's two measures here. A is not measurable here, but if you have a form or an input that's about legal or financial, it's AA compliant. If you have all those forms with error prevention, it's AA compliant. If you have all your forms with error prevention or all your inputs with error prevention, it's AAA compliant. The fourth one is the obvious one. It's about screen readers. If your product is screen readable, there's only one area where this is measurable. It's compatible. So if it's compatible with screen readers, and if your product is parsable by a screen reader, if you use the attribute name, role, and value, it's A compliant. If through attributes in HTML, like array labels, I'm going to speak with them just in a second. If through attributes, the screen reader can understand the status of your product, it's AA compliant, and there's actually nothing measured on AAA. Okay, so we already know the state of our products. How can we adapt the current status to accessible? Very quick design tips. First one, again, design alternatives. I think might be obvious for all of us that red means error, but if you're colorblind, you have no clue what red means. So maybe a label saying that there are errors. This is kind of a standard that is rectangle with round corners might be an input, but if you sell actually the input, it's even more obvious. So design alternatives. Second design tip, it's very important that your user perceives what's active, what's focused, and what's the main subject. Doesn't matter the design. This is not, it should be underlined, it should be a border, it should be a background, but it should perceive it. In these three cases, all of you know that the main subject here, it's the ipsum, on what on ipsum. Tell the user what's focused. And the last one, which I mentioned by the third time by now, make your product, the contrast of your product correct. For you, this is measured on proportions. So if you have a color, the same color side by side, it's 1:1. To give you an example on how further you can go, the white to black that you see here, it's 21:1. And to be AA, there's no A compliance. To be AA compliant for headers, I think you have to be 3:1. And for the text should be 4.5:1. That should be the proportion of difference in color. If you need to be AAA compliant, the 4.5 goes to the headers, and to the rest of your elements should be 7:1. It sounds easy because you look at this and you think, 21:1 to black, between black and white, it's going to be really cool. But I've worked with two major companies that the main colors are orange and white, and it was impossible to make those colors compliant. And someone in the front row also has it. So, code. If a screen reader looks at this, do you know what it reads? Not all of you at the same time again? No? Adapt button, correct. How about this one? It's a very obvious 5 slider. Why 5? Because if you then specify a value, it goes to the middle of your input, and it's a slider, so it says it's a slider. So, crash course on HTML. First, the text fundamentals. Use and abuse headings and paragraphs for a simple reason is that a screen reader knows what those mean. Hierarchy is a thing. So whenever you think HTML5 is not that important because if it's an aside or a div, nobody cares. Yeah, we care. Screen readers care and users care. And hierarchy is very important because usually, unless you do it otherwise, screen readers read from top to bottom. The way to screw this up is with CSS. I'll get there in a second. Hire a copywriter, seriously. Why seriously? Because when I wrote this, I had the typo. It was not on purpose, so I just left it there. Hire a copywriter. unless you really know how to speak with users, or your product owner, product specialist, whatever you call it, knows how to speak with users. Copywriters should have this role. And again, emphasis and strong, they exist for a reason. HTML5 exists for a reason. Use it. So now real codes. If we go to the accessibility API, you might have encountered the case where you want to develop something that already exists natively, but you want to give it a different look or different logic. The first step to do it is through role. So without that role button on the div, it will be perceived as just adapt. And if you give it the role button, the screen readers will understand it as a button. It's not focusable yet. What makes, not sure if that's a word, it's not able to focus until you put a tab index. There's 3 types of inputs on the tab index. 0 means it's the natural order. So from top to bottom, you'll understand when you do tab, 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 it will arrive on that element on the right order. If it's -1, it means that you really know what you're doing and you don't want it to be on the right order, so it takes it out. And if you put a number, the numbers means the order. So avoid the numbers. Let's say you put a 3, that means it's going to be the 3rd element that's going to be focusable. If you change your HTML slice here, or if your compiler or transpiler, whatever, puts the code in the wrong order, you're screwed. So avoid using positive numbers for the tab index. Just use 0 if it's the right position, or -1 if you don't want it to be on the right position for being focused. Correia. So I mentioned before how to give the product or your product the way to tell the screen readers the status of your application without actually developing it. That's through area labels. I'm not going to go through them all because there's tons and tons of area labels. There's area labels for every single case. If you just type area labels, you'll get to the list and you'll find exactly what you need. In this case, I adapted the input so it actually reads ARIA. So if you use ARIA labels, the screen reader knows, so it will tell the user this is man-made. ARIA, amount of adaptation, 5 slider, min 0, max 10. And those are achieved through these things. ARIA labeled by will interpret the label at the top, so it won't read it twice, and it will tell that's the right description for this input. Let's talk about CSS. Text again. Line height, font weight, obviously font size, and the font family. If your designer does something fishy, flag it. I'm sure you know which one here has the worst accessibility. You at the back, do you know what's written in there? You know because I copied. That's the wrong question. Sorry? Yeah. So care about the font, care about the line height. Like the second to last, the line height is very small. I think I used 1 there, not sure. Or 0.9, something like that. So it actually overlaps a bit. Be careful about the font family attributes in CSS. So when I spoke about adapting your product, this is the worst one for me. This is actually, I think CSS-wise, this is the hardest one. Two very quick examples. My father, every time he enters a new website, he does Control+. It just raises the font size and it puts everything large and breaks every single layout on every single website. So if you design that, cool. It's through an A, minus an A+. Users who see that, they know what that means. But that means that you design your product scalable. Not responsive. Responsive is a different thing. Scalable. And the second example is we have a colleague, our recruiter. She sees everything very small. I have no clue why. I already asked why. But she sees everything very small. And she does Control-, and everything shrinks and she loses stuff because it's under position with CSS. So this is the hardest thing to achieve through CSS. It's scalability. Remember this in like Windows 97 or something? This is actually Windows 10 that I stole from the internet. Doesn't matter. This means high contrast. Some people are very difficult perceiving white backgrounds with black text. This helps. This also helps. I don't know how because I'm not colorblind, but this also helps colorblind people. So if you design your product in high contrast, it will help those types of people. Be careful of changing defaults. Those are not the right colors. I have to change the bit a bit to increase the contrast. But these are the defaults of HTML. People know what italic means. People know what bold means. People know that abbreviations are with the dots underlined. So usually you can mouse over and it will have a tooltip or something stating what the abbreviation is. If you change these styles, be careful to make it obvious to the user why are you changing. Like everybody in the room probably knows that an underlined text in web probably means it's a link. The default one from HTML is blue, and if you already visited, it's purple, and if it's active, so when you press, it's red. And obviously the cursors, those are the default ones. Remember, like 15 or 20 years ago, everybody was changing the cursor with rainbows and so on. So if you're changing those behaviors, make sure you know why you're changing, and make sure your users understand those changes. Go down. Screen readers don't care about CSS, usually. This is the main subject that screen readers care, it's visibility. So if you want something to be interpreted by a screen reader, never use visibility or display none. Visibility, there's a mistake there. Visibility hidden, haha, and display none. If you need to make something invisible, but you want it to be read, just use position, like do an element with 0 pixels height, 0 pixels width, and overflow hidden, it's fine. Position also works fine, but if you want it to be interpreted, don't use those instructions, although the first one has a typo. Be careful about assuming that the MIDI is a screen. A lot of people steal prints. They're not that environmental friendly, and you can use MIDI queries for that. This is the one for print. So when you do this, it means that one is there in the print preview. You can actually control the CSS there. It's very useful although Chrome and Firefox and those browsers, they already do this kind of magic behind the scenes, but if you have white text and you want to make sure it's black, for instance, on print, this is through this. And this is the capital sin. Unless you really know what you're doing, never, ever do this. What this thing does, I think now it's blue or orange. I think it's blue. When you focus, it puts like a blur around your inputs and stuff like that. Those are for people to know that it's focused. So if you want to change the look of that, that's fine, but do it. Don't just remove it because it's not cool. I never encountered a case where this was useful. So be careful about this line. Let's talk JavaScript. JavaScript is not going to be your biggest help or your biggest problem with accessibility, but there are still problems and some advantage with JavaScript. Problems are complexity. So if you have something in WebGL or a game or something very complex, those are extremely hard to make accessible. Like games, you can still map something to keyboard, maybe, but those are really, really difficult to make accessible. So if you have one of those cases, make sure that you actually need this, because it's going to be a huge development effort. Server-side only logic can hurt your accessibility. Let's think, for example, that you have server-side validations and you don't have any front-end validation, which don't do that. But let's imagine, and the internet breaks in between or something like that. Your user doesn't know that there's an error there and doesn't know why the form is not working. So server-side only logic, no, use JavaScript for it. And the mouse-specific events, you already should have an idea by now why, and this is one of the things that, I should have changed the order. One of the things that JavaScript can help us with, it's keyboard events. It's to make alternatives to mouse events. Skip links are something to develop to screen readers. Your user probably knows your website. Your user probably knows by heart what the screen reader is going to say. So every time you refresh or change pages, if it has to read the header all over again, it's boring. So skip links does that. So it's probably one of the first things to read. It's after it's entered your product. Do you want to skip the header? And then you can just use your imagination to help your users. Let's say that you have forms and you have autocomplete. It can help everybody that has difficult typing, for example. This is the areas that JavaScript can help you. Don't forget to adapt. Every single framework and library has its own perks. We use React at the time at Zalando, so we use some linters specific for React and A11Y. Just do a quick search on Google for your technology or your stack and accessibility to you'll find a linter and it will help you quite a lot on your development process. A quick example on very specific accessibility. This is a talk that I gave a few months ago about web components accessibility. It's quite trickier, so it can get really specific. Just search and research how to make your tech stack accessible. This is a style guide for if you're lost and you want to start. This is a style guide for elements that are quite common. Let's say that you want to make a checkbox accessible, if you want to make forms accessible, if you need to do some articles accessible. They have examples. They have actually code examples, and you can check them how to start. And the fifth one, which was the one I started, it's the one I'm doing now. So it's on you now. You know all of this. You are experts in accessibility. Share, drag it to your companies, bug your products. This is not an overthought. If it's it's not an afterthought. If it's an afterthought, it's going to bite you in the ass. And a quick recap before the Q&A. I want you to remember, your product should make sense. Develop keyword input. Write content alternatives. Be careful about contrast. Thank you. Who's first? All the people. There you go. I'm not sure if there's a microphone.
What's your opinion on CSS reset files?
Sorry?
CSS reset files. Your opinion on that? Those files.
My opinion as a designer or as an accessibility guy here? So as a designer, they're pretty useful. And as a development also, because it will put your project at the start of your project. They will all look the same. But please look at those resetters. It's pretty common to just import them. Don't care. Look at what they're resetting. There are some good resetters there that are more than A11Y approved, because we are not the first ones to do this. But you're a developer. You'll understand that code. Just look at what they're resetting. If there's an outline none there, just adapt it. It's open source, so probably. So. Yeah. So in the CI, for sure you can use the A11Y because it will go against, but that's very HTML specific. What you can do is, I cannot offer an answer with React, but I can offer with Angular. I'm not sure if you know Protector. Okay, so Protector is a wrapper on Selenium, and it tests UI live, so on real browsers. And that's Node, so you can actually develop whatever you want on top of it. One of the things we did at ING, with one of the companies I worked for, was we did screen recording for every single test, and then we compared them for mistakes. It was not actually about accessibility. It was about those specific UI changes, but you can actually compare those screenshots with contrasts and stuff like that. Don't forget, if you have testers or if you're on a tester, you are a person, so look at that. But Protector, you can put it on RCI. A11Y, you can put on your CI. Linters, for sure, you can put on your CI. It actually breaks hours if you have A11Y mistakes, but it won't catch design problems. It will catch code problems. Oh, someone at the back? Yeah. No, I haven't worked with external design for quite a while. I've worked with design systems for like 5 years now. And the way we do this, of course, the orange and the white is one of the biggest problems in Zalando now, and at ING at the time. We actually had to change the image. I think Zalando is still evaluating it, but at ING, the orange was dropped for the UI. It was just left for the logo. Yeah, so it depends on how I develop. The way we do it at Zalando, it's, I'm not sure you're familiar with atomic design. Okay, so we use electrons for checking it. So you cannot actually develop CSS. You have to use those electrons to compose your components. So we are sure as developers that you're not breaking accessibility guidelines. But it really depends on how you develop. I found that atomic design can help you quite a lot. More? We good? So thank you.